What most people saw in the headlines sounded like just another flare-up in a trade dispute, another round of diplomatic chest-thumping between Washington and Ottawa. But that surface story misses what actually just happened, and it misses it in a dangerous way. What we are really watching is the quiet unraveling of a military-industrial relationship that the United States has depended on for generations, often without even realizing it. And once you see that, you start to understand why so many people inside the Pentagon are suddenly nervous, even if they are not saying it out loud. On paper, the United States spends more on its military than the next several countries combined. You are constantly told that this guarantees security, dominance, and independence, but that story assumes something that is no longer true, which is that military power is built entirely inside national borders. In reality, modern weapon systems are not national products. They are international supply chains stitched together across dozens of countries, firms, and regulatory regimes. Canada sits at the center of that web in ways most Americans have never been encouraged to think about. What officially happened is fairly simple. Canada announced that it would prioritize its own defense needs and the needs of selected allied partners when it comes to advanced aerospace components, sensors, materials, and specialized manufacturing. This was framed as a sovereignty measure, a resilience strategy, a way to ensure domestic readiness in an increasingly unstable world. From a Canadian perspective, that framing makes sense, but from the American side, it landed like an earthquake. Because the part that rarely gets discussed is how deeply embedded Canadian firms and public research institutions are in U.S. weapons production. We are not talking about marginal inputs that can be swapped out overnight. We are talking about components that require years of certification, shared standards, and trust built up over decades. Landing systems, avionics, advanced materials, guidance technologies, these are not things you just replace by calling a new supplier and signing a contract. And here is where the deeper economic reality comes in. The so-called America First approach assumed that allies would remain dependable no matter how they were treated, that supply chains would stay open even as tariffs, threats, and unilateral decisions piled up. That assumption was never guaranteed. It was a political bet, and Canada has now called it. This is not about punishment or theatrics. It is about leverage. Canada looked at the structure of North American defense production and realized something crucial. It was not just a junior partner, it was a backbone. And when you control a backbone, you do not need to shout. You just need to rebalance priorities. For the U.S. defense industry, this creates a problem that money alone cannot instantly solve. You can appropriate billions, but you cannot instantly recreate manufacturing ecosystems, skilled labor pools, and regulatory alignment that were built across borders. That takes time, years, often decades. In the meantime, delays ripple outward, programs slip, costs rise, readiness projections quietly get revised downward. What is striking is how poorly this reality has been explained to the public. The media focus stays on personalities, on leaders posturing, on who looks strong or weak in the moment. Almost no attention is paid to the underlying structure of production and dependence. That is not an accident. Talking about structure forces uncomfortable questions about how power actually works in modern capitalism and about how much of American military strength has been quietly outsourced. From a broader perspective, this moment fits a pattern we have seen again and again. Countries that were treated as interchangeable inputs eventually recognize their own strategic value. When they do, they start acting like sovereign economic actors rather than loyal subcontractors. Canada's move signals that shift clearly. For ordinary people, this might feel abstract, but it is not. When defense programs stall, the costs do not just show up in budget spreadsheets. They show up in layoffs in certain regions, in higher taxes or deeper deficits, in fewer resources for non-military needs that still somehow never get funded, and they show up in heightened insecurity, the very thing military spending is supposed to prevent. The larger lesson here is sobering. Military power in the modern world is not just about size or spending, it is about relationships, trust, and economic integration. When those fray, the illusion of unilateral strength collapses quickly. And once that collapse begins, it is very hard to reverse without fundamentally rethinking how power is organized and shared. That is what makes this moment so important to pay attention to. Not because of who said what at a podium, but because of what it reveals about the fragility of systems that were long assumed to be permanent. If you want to understand where global power is really shifting, you have to stop looking only at flags and start looking at supply chains, incentives, and control. That is where the real story is unfolding, whether the headlines acknowledge it or not. Once you start looking at it this way, a lot of things that seemed confusing suddenly make sense. For years, the United States treated economic integration with Canada as a one-way street, as if proximity automatically guaranteed loyalty. The assumption was that shared history and shared institutions would override material interests, but economic systems do not run on sentiment, they run on incentives, power, and risk management. Canada has been quietly adjusting its risk calculus for a long time, and this moment is the visible outcome of that shift. Think about what it means to build a modern fighter jet, a missile defense system, or an advanced surveillance platform. These are not single products rolling off a national assembly line. They are modular systems assembled from thousands of specialized components, each governed by export controls, intellectual property rules, and long-term supplier relationships. When one of those nodes tightens, the whole system feels it, and Canada controls more of those nodes than most Americans have ever been told. This is why the reaction inside the U.S. defense establishment has been so anxious. Publicly, everything is calm. Privately, planners understand that redundancy in theory does not equal redundancy in practice. You cannot simply reshuffle suppliers without requalifying systems, renegotiating contracts, and redesigning timelines. The friction is enormous, the costs compound, and all of that undermines the very readiness metrics that justify massive military budgets in the first place. What is especially revealing is how this exposes the contradiction at the heart of nationalist economic rhetoric. On the one hand, you are told that globalization made the country weak and dependent. On the other hand, the same leaders embraced defense globalization because it lowered costs and boosted corporate profits. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot denounce interdependence in speeches while relying on it in practice, especially in something as complex as military production. Canada's response forces that contradiction into the open. By prioritizing its own needs and those of partners it sees as stable and cooperative, Canada is doing exactly what economic rationality dictates. It is reducing exposure to political volatility. It is protecting domestic capabilities. It is leveraging its position in global value chains to gain strategic autonomy. None of that is radical. It is textbook political economy. The reason it feels shocking in Washington is because the United States has grown accustomed to being the only actor allowed to behave this way. When smaller or mid-sized powers assert the same logic, it gets labeled as betrayal rather than prudence. That double standard has always been there. Now it is colliding with material reality. And notice who is paying the immediate price. It is not the executives who design these globalized defense systems. They have exit options, consulting contracts, and revolving doors. It is workers on the ground who face uncertainty when programs slow or get restructured. It is communities tied to defense manufacturing that suddenly find themselves exposed to decisions made far above their heads. Once again, risk is socialized downward while strategic miscalculations remain insulated at the top. The media framing largely avoids this. Instead of asking how supply chain power shapes military capability, coverage drifts toward personality conflicts and nationalist drama. That keeps viewers emotionally engaged while leaving the underlying structure untouched. But if you care about where power is actually moving, you have to ignore the theater and follow the production networks. This episode should also prompt a deeper question that rarely gets asked. If American security depends so heavily on foreign inputs, why was there never a serious public debate about that dependence? Why were voters never told that strength was contingent, conditional, and shared? The answer is uncomfortable, because acknowledging that reality would have challenged the myth of unilateral control that sustains political legitimacy at home. As we move forward, the key thing to watch is not whether tempers cool or statements soften. It is whether the United States confronts the structural vulnerabilities this moment has revealed, or whether it doubles down on rhetoric while hoping the old arrangements somehow snap back into place. History suggests that hoping is not a strategy. If this story feels familiar, that is because it echoes across energy, technology, food systems, and finance. Whenever power is assumed rather than maintained through mutual respect and stable institutions, it eventually erodes. Canada's move is not an anomaly, it is a signal, and the real question is whether anyone in Washington is prepared to listen before the costs become even harder to hide. To understand why this keeps happening, you have to zoom out and look at the system that produced it. Over the last few decades, defense production was reorganized according to the same logic that reshaped the rest of the economy. Outsource where possible, specialize narrowly, cut costs, concentrate ownership, fragment responsibility. From a corporate balance sheet perspective, this looked efficient. From a national resilience perspective, it created hidden fragility. Canada became indispensable not because it was trying to dominate anyone, but because it invested steadily in specific capabilities that others let hollow out: skilled aerospace labor, advanced material science, precision manufacturing, and public institutions that supported long-term research instead of quarterly returns. These are not accidental outcomes. They are policy choices made over time. And once those capabilities exist, they become leverage whether you intend them to or not. The United States, meanwhile, moved in the opposite direction in many areas. Public investment in industrial capacity became politically suspect. Labor was treated as a cost to be minimized rather than a strategic asset. Defense contractors consolidated, reducing redundancy and resilience while increasing political influence. On paper, the system looked powerful. In practice, it became brittle. This is where the class dimension becomes impossible to ignore. Decisions about supply chains and production were not made democratically. They were made by executives, financiers, and policymakers operating in a shared ecosystem of incentives. Their priority was profitability, market share, and stock performance. National security was invoked rhetorically but subordinated operationally. The costs of that choice were deferred, not eliminated. Now they are coming due. For ordinary people, this shows up in ways that are easy to miss but deeply consequential. When a defense program runs over budget, something else gets cut. When timelines slip, political pressure builds to extract savings elsewhere. That often means squeezing public services, delaying infrastructure, or justifying austerity in areas that actually affect daily life. The same system that claims unlimited resources for military dominance somehow never has enough for housing, healthcare, or education. And here is the bitter irony. The very interdependence that made the system vulnerable could have been a source of shared stability if it had been managed cooperatively. Integration does not have to mean subordination, but that requires respect, predictability, and institutional trust. When trade policy becomes a weapon and alliances are treated as transactional, partners respond rationally by insulating themselves. Canada's decision to deepen security ties with other partners reflects that logic. It is not about exclusion for its own sake, it is about diversification. No country that has learned the lessons of recent years wants to be locked into a single volatile relationship. From an economic standpoint, that is just portfolio management applied to national strategy. What is most striking is how predictable this outcome was. Economists have warned for years that weaponizing trade and alliances would provoke defensive responses, not emotional ones, structural ones. You do not fight volatility with loyalty, you fight it with options. Canada has created options for itself. The United States is discovering that it assumed options it no longer fully controls. The media still struggles to explain this because it resists talking about power as something embedded in production rather than personalities. It is easier to frame events as diplomatic spats than as systemic shifts. But if you want to understand why this moment matters, you have to abandon the idea that military strength exists independently of economic organization. It does not. We are living through a period where the old assumptions of dominance are colliding with the realities of a multipolar interdependent world. The question is not whether that world exists, it already does. The question is whether political institutions are willing to adapt to it honestly, or whether they will cling to myths until those myths collapse under their own weight. This is not about assigning blame to one country or another. It is about recognizing how systems reward certain behaviors until they no longer can. When cooperation is treated as weakness and leverage is treated as entitlement, the system teaches everyone to protect themselves. Canada learned that lesson. Others are learning it too. And once that learning spreads, it reshapes the terrain in ways that speeches alone cannot undo. At this point, it becomes impossible to pretend that this is just a temporary disagreement or a negotiating tactic. What we are seeing is a structural realignment, and structural changes do not reverse simply because leaders change their tone. Once supply chains are reoriented, once standards diverge, once trust erodes, the old equilibrium is gone. That is the part that rarely gets acknowledged because it forces a reckoning with past choices rather than offering a quick fix. Inside the United States, there is a deep reluctance to admit how much military power has come to depend on private corporate networks operating across borders. The mythology says the Pentagon commands, industry obeys, and allies follow. The reality is far messier. Defense firms respond to contracts, margins, and regulatory certainty. Allies respond to predictability and mutual respect. When either of those disappears, the system starts to fragment. This fragmentation has real consequences for how power is exercised. A military that cannot reliably produce or maintain its most advanced systems loses flexibility. It becomes more cautious, more constrained, even if its headline budget remains enormous. That gap between appearance and capability is dangerous because it encourages overconfidence at the political level while limiting options on the ground. What is especially telling is how quickly officials pivot to language about resilience once vulnerability becomes visible. Resilience suddenly becomes the new priority, as if it were not undermined by decades of policy. But resilience is not a slogan. It is the outcome of sustained investment, institutional memory, and social trust. You cannot improvise it under pressure. Canada's approach highlights this contrast. By treating industrial capacity as a public concern rather than a purely private one, it preserved tools that now matter enormously. That does not mean Canada is immune to the same pressures that hollowed out capacity elsewhere. It means the damage was less severe, and therefore leverage remains. This moment also exposes a deeper failure of democratic accountability. Voters were never asked whether they were comfortable outsourcing core elements of national security. They were never shown the trade-offs clearly. Instead, they were told that efficiency and dominance were compatible, that markets would take care of the details, and that allies would always be there. That story was politically convenient. It was also incomplete. When the consequences finally appear, they are framed as surprises or betrayals rather than as predictable outcomes of policy. That framing deflects responsibility away from the system and toward external actors. It invites anger outward rather than reflection inward. And that in turn makes constructive adjustment harder. For ordinary people, this cycle breeds cynicism. You are told one thing for years, then suddenly the opposite. Strength turns out to be dependence. Control turns out to be fragility. And the costs of adjusting fall on you, not on the people who made the original decisions. This is how trust in institutions erodes. Not because people are irrational, but because their lived experience contradicts the narrative they were given. If there is a lesson worth holding on to here, it is that power built on denial is temporary. You cannot ignore material relationships and expect rhetoric to carry you indefinitely. You cannot treat partners as expendable and expect permanence. Eventually, the underlying economics assert themselves. As this story continues, pay attention to what is not being said. Watch for quiet program delays, subtle budget reallocations, and vague language about modernization and reform. Those are signals that adaptation is happening behind the scenes, even if it is not being explained honestly to the public. And ask yourself a harder question. If military strength depends on cooperation, production, and social investment, what else have we been told is secure that actually rests on fragile foundations? Once you start asking that, you begin to see similar patterns everywhere, and that is where real understanding begins, not with outrage, but with clarity. When you step back and look at the broader pattern, it becomes clear that this moment is less about Canada asserting itself and more about the United States confronting the limits of a model it helped design. A model where everything, even security, was treated as a market transaction, where redundancy was inefficient, labor was expendable, and long-term capacity was sacrificed for short-term gains. That model delivered profits and political talking points for a while. It did not deliver resilience. What makes this especially uncomfortable is that the warning signs were always there. Supply chain shocks in other sectors already showed how quickly just-in-time systems fail under stress. Energy markets, medical equipment, semiconductors, each time the response was framed as exceptional rather than systemic. Defense was assumed to be different, insulated by scale and secrecy. But defense follows the same economic logic as everything else. It cannot escape it. Canada's move forces that realization into the open. By acting as a sovereign economic actor, it exposes the fiction that one country can dominate an interconnected system indefinitely. That does not mean Canada is suddenly omnipotent. It means it understands where its leverage lies and is willing to use it to protect its own interests. That is what rational actors do in a system that rewards foresight.